All right, so thanks everyone for coming. My name is Hod Greeley. I'm a developer advocate here at Couchbase. And tonight I'm going to be taking a look at React Native and showing that in combination with Swagger and Couchbase Mobile and how to build an app. A nice illustration of all those technologies together. So first thing I wanted to get kind of a feel for the room. So who here has actually tried React Native, tried building something in React Native before? Just a couple of people. Okay, that's good. So I actually set it up to walk through sort of the hello world of React Native to give you an idea, because I think it's a little too complex to dive into the example application that I'll show later without having a little bit of that context. So this is perfect. Okay, great. So I already mentioned the three technologies. I'll be giving an overview of each one. So React Native and something called Swagger, and then of course Couchbase Mobile. And then we'll take a look, as I mentioned, at the sort of hello world version of React Native. And then I'll actually go ahead and walk through a to-do application, which is, people have started using this as kind of the standard way to illustrate, because it illustrates so many aspects of a realistic application. So what is React Native? So React Native is a framework for building cross-platform applications. Right now it works for both Android and iOS. It originally worked for iOS, and they added the Android capability. And I want to emphasize that this is unlike a lot of other cross-platform frameworks. That this one of the things that was actually critical to the people that originated this was to be able to build an actually native application. So it's not an app running in a web view. It's actually using native controls and things like this. This actually came from Facebook. So how many people remember the Facebook announcement when they said that they tried to build Facebook as a web app, essentially, and decided that it was a bad decision? That was about 3 years ago, I think, or something like that, when Mark Zuckerberg said that. So Facebook had developed React for doing web development as kind of, that's more of a library set. They refer to React Native as a framework as opposed to React.js as being kind of a JavaScript library. And then they actually they took a lot of the ideas from that and started building and produced React Native about 2 years ago. So one of the goals of it was to be able to develop for mobile using JavaScript. There's actually a great quote from a Ray Wenderlich tutorial, which I can't read on my screen. Well, so they go a little bit overboard maybe, but it says, React introduces a novel, radical, and highly functional approach to constructing user interfaces. In brief, the application UI is simply expressed as a function of the application state, which all sounds very nice, right? So one of the key things about React is that it allows you to build your UI out of components. So you basically are composing it out of reusable components, and we'll see that actually in the not the Hello World app, because that's too simple, but in the other application. And also the React is really meant to be only about UI, so it's more or less agnostic as to how you're running the rest of your logic. A lot of people typically will combine it with something called Flux, that does a lot of the sort of marshalling of data around and things like that. But it really is focused on making UI easy to build. And it goes along with this kind of paradigm of functional programming. So what I'm getting at here is that the approach that they've taken that they want to achieve, you can work around this, but you have to kind of work at it. But the idea is that essentially is that your UI is purely a function of state. So you'll have a bunch of state variables that go with your components. You're feeding data into those. It's a unidirectional data flow of setting the state of the components, and then from that state it derives the UI with kind of nothing external to it. So people have found this to be a much cleaner way to build applications. I don't know how many people are kind of familiar with two-way data binding, but you end up with these issues when you get into complex applications where you have this kind of cascade problem where one change somewhere means that it has to propagate into state somewhere else, and that ends up potentially cascading into a whole bunch of things. And so the idea is that the sort of unidirectional data flow actually helps prevent that and still allows you to do everything you want to do. So I'm just going to run through quickly some of the highlights of things that people like to say make React different. So declarative UI, so actually a lot easier to build than an imperative UI where you're building it programmatically or something like that. So you're able essentially to build out your UI in kind of a human readable form. Component-based, like I said, we'll see how we have, in particular, a list component that ends up being used multiple times in the application. So you can build little bundled chunks of your application and reuse these pieces. It really pushes forward this notion of trying to build based on a functional paradigm. Makes no assumptions about anything outside of itself, of how you're building. So, like I say, it does kind of direct you down this road of the unidirectional data flow and the functional approach to building things, but it doesn't really dictate, that you have to do that with particular other libraries or things like that. It uses this, I think, if I remember right, this stands for Java syntax extension, which is actually really cool. It kind of looks like it allows you to put XML into your code. So it's kind of flips around the typical HTML, CSS, and JavaScript situation where you essentially have your HTML markup, and then you have code that's interspersed in that, and kind of flips it around where you actually have the XML that's interspersed. I mean, it's tricky about the difference because it looks sort of like the same thing, but in fact it turns out that what happens is that they're actually compiling the tags into JavaScript. So you could actually do everything that they're doing in JavaScript, but it makes it much cleaner and easier to do some things. Talked a bunch about the unidirectional data flow already. One of the things that always comes up when you're building cross-platform apps is how you deal with native capabilities that you don't have access to. This is one of the big challenges of ever building a cross-functional tool, is that different platforms offer different capabilities, and how do you hook everything in? And so it's typically not really practical to do that. So React addresses this with a bridging mechanism. So they have their bridging protocol that allows you to build your own native components that you can hook into the system. They actually support JavaScript version 6 through actually, I think it depends because it uses different JavaScript runtimes. So in some cases, it will actually use Babel, which is a compiler that can take the JavaScript 6 standard and backward compile it to JavaScript 5. And so in some systems, I think they use that. In some systems, it'll actually just run natively ES6. And then you can do styling, and they've modeled the styling so it's a lot like CSS. So if you're familiar with CSS from the web, the styling stuff will look very familiar. So that was a quick thing. So like I said, that was I'm kind of going to do this in stages where I'll do that introduction. I'm going to look at Swagger and then talk a little bit about Couchbase, and then we'll go look at the React back up to the simple React intro app. So what is Swagger? Swagger is most easily demonstrated by kind of showing it to you. So Swagger is how is that showing up? I need to expand that. So Swagger is really, at the core of Swagger is this specification. Oh, come on. Let's do this the hard way. Okay. So Swagger is really an ecosystem of tools and I don't know, a bunch of things. So this site in particular shows you some of what's going on. That's built around being able to define a REST API and do a bunch of things with it. So it's at the core of it, like I said, it's a Swagger spec. So I'm actually in the Swagger editor right now. And what I'm showing you is the Swagger spec that we built for Sync Gateway. Actually, and this works for Couchbase Lite too in the situation. So this is how I'm going to be able to work with Couchbase Lite with JavaScript without having to have a kind of really special purpose client for it. So just to give kind of a sample of other things is that we've actually built, so all our documentation now uses Swagger. So this is all auto-generated from the Swagger spec. And so what's really cool about it is you get this embedded documentation that you can actually do things like just give it some of the parameters and it'll tell you, since these are REST APIs, it'll tell you like what the curl command line is that you could use to try this out. And you can actually try it out directly. So I wanted to actually show that. So here in the Swagger editor, I've now got the one version of the documentation essentially generated from it. And so I'm going to actually show you I've got Sync Gateway up, so I'm getting a little ahead. I'll explain the whole Couchbase Mobile stack in a second, but in a sense, Sync Gateway is kind of a backing store. And so right now you can see I have this is the administration interface for it. I've got no documents in there. So I want to go ahead and actually put a document into there. So let's see if this is going to be nice to me. I'm looking at the wrong one, of course. I thought I had this set on. Sorry, I have to find the post method. Oh, come on. So, okay, I'll show one nice thing is that I can narrow this down to sections of this. So now I'm just looking at all the stuff that's dealing with documents. Here's my put. There's the post method. Okay, so this is cool. So it gives the description. This request will create a new document. I have a couple parameters, so I can actually go ahead and open this up. And let's see if I can make a document that'll work on the fly. It's a trusty key value pair. And I want to stick it in a database that I've handily named DB. And if all things go well, okay, well, it gave me an error, so at least you can see that I got a response. Let me see if I can figure out what it did wrong. server crashed. Yep, okay. All right, well, I won't get hung up on that for too long. Or maybe I will. What happened to my window? Go away. Okay, first demo of the night. Doesn't work out. But the next piece that's cool about this that I'll show is that you can use this to generate SDKs for a huge number of languages. And so that's why I kind of bring this up, and partly because it's really neat that you can do a whole bunch of things, and it kind of makes sense, right? Like REST endpoints aren't that complicated. You can figure out all the networking stuff and whatever is largely boilerplate, and so why not make something that auto-generates all of these things? And so, but in particular, we don't have a JavaScript SDK for Couchbase Lite. So to enable us to use React Native and to use the JavaScript in there rather than trying to build all of the bridging stuff that we would need for Couchbase Mobile, we just end up using the Swagger spec and the Swagger library. So we'll see what that looks like in the actual code. There's other really handy things about it, like it's sort of self-documenting. So when you're actually using the SDK, you can actually just tack a help piece on the end of any of the calls, and it'll print out like to the log what the parameters are and such that you're using. So it's really neat that you can build these kinds of playgrounds and do all this other stuff with it. Does that give people kind of an idea of the purpose of it? So I've written a blog post about using the Swagger client with Node for doing things like working directly with Sync Gateway and stuff to implement business logic and stuff. So how many people are familiar with Couchbase Mobile already? One. Wow, okay. I've got a whole brand new crowd here. All right, so, well, good. Let me dive into that then. So Couchbase Mobile that's what we refer to this entire stack. So Couchbase actually has kind of two, what I would say, main product lines. There's Couchbase Server. So Couchbase Server is an enterprise operational NoSQL database. It's a document-oriented database. There's a bunch of buzzwords in there if you don't know what all of those mean. But the key thing is that this is an operational database that big enterprises rely on. But many years ago, somebody had the inspiration that building products on mobile that synchronize and handle data changes and stuff well is actually a really hard problem. And so we built from the ground up the rest of the stack that fits with Couchbase Server. And so we have the two other components, Couchbase Lite. So I always kind of like to split the ends, like kind of a bookending of one. On one side you have Couchbase Server, on the other end you have Couchbase Lite. So Couchbase Lite is an actual fully functional NoSQL document-oriented database that you can use purely standalone if you want in applications on mobile. It's cross-platform, goes across, I won't even been able to name them all. And I always do this, I get ahead of myself, so I'm actually going to go through some more details in the other slides. But one of the key things to think about is that I love using Couchbase Lite because working with JSON documents is a lot nicer than trying to set up a relational database for things. And so even if I'm not worried about the synchronization issues with a mobile application, I think Couchbase Lite is actually a really nice thing to substitute for, because on both Android and iOS, essentially under the hood, on Android you're directly using SQLite, and on the core data that iOS uses is actually underneath is using SQLite as well. So rather than dealing with all the issues, like I said, of a relational system, that I prefer to just use Couchbase Mobile. And then we have what in some ways seems like maybe not that important a piece, but something called Sync Gateway. And this is really kind of your cloud edge piece. So typically you wouldn't want your server exposed. You have it behind your firewalls and locked down. So for synchronization purposes, we don't talk directly to the database. We talk through this system called Sync Gateway. And there's a bunch of nice features about this. One is the security aspect that you're not exposing your database. Another is that it actually lets you kind of partition up your logic there between different stages. And in particular with Sync Gateway, you can actually use Sync Gateway to do data routing to clients. And it takes care of, it essentially enables the whole synchronization piece. So when I'm talking about data synchronization, I really mean so you picture, I have a mobile application, a couple different people are using the same mobile application, they're offline, whatever, they're making changes to their data, sometimes they're changing the same information, they go back online, and you've got this problem now of how do you get that information back to your back-end systems? How do you propagate it also between the devices? How do you resolve the conflicts that the people have potentially created in the data that they've modified in the application? All of this, when you get into it, has brings up a bunch of issues that aren't necessarily very obvious when you look on it in sort of first blush. So it's what I think of is we've built kind of an industrial strength synchronization capability, and that hinges on Sync Gateway to a large degree. I think I'm going to give up doing this in my slides because I always do this to myself where I go through. So I'll just talk really briefly about so there, when I say cross-platform, one of the nice things is that it's not just Android and iOS, but you get things like Windows Phone, tvOS, things like Xamarin, PhoneGap, as we'll see, React Native. And what was the other thing I was thinking? Oh yeah, that's right. I was my favorite part of the example. So we also have a Java version of it, pure Java version of it, and I kind of joke with people. It's like, why do we care about that? Well, if I close my laptop right now, what happens? I'm basically offline, right? And if I take my laptop outside and I don't have any network connectivity, then this is essentially a mobile device in some sense. So what's nice is you can actually build with the Java version of it. You can embed, build applications that will run on a desktop as well that have all of these synchronization capabilities and stuff, and you can treat it like an offline first experience, as they say. Are people familiar with the term? I don't know, this is kind of coming up more and more with offline first approach to app development, which is really the idea of giving the user the best user experience that you can enable even when they're not connected to a network. And that's a big part of why you build something like Couchbase Mobile. So Sync Gateway, it's actually more, so we'll look at a lot of the REST interface, but there's actually more to it. It's interesting. Sync Gateway in sort of solving the synchronization problem, you're essentially kind of combining a database with a bunch of networking capabilities, which actually makes it a really powerful platform for doing a lot of things. And so things like the stream, batch, and event APIs, so you can do like event-driven development based on something we call the changes feed. So in order to enable the synchronization, you basically have to have Sync Gateway you can subscribe to a feed from it that will tell you things that are happening in the database, and so you can actually drive a bunch of logic that way. I have some blog posts about that, some examples in our documentation too, and it's really cool. So I think one example that somebody talks about is if you wanted to do something like drive a photo processing system, you could actually have disparate pieces of it on built through different components, maybe even running on different machines, and effectively run a state machine by updating documents through Sync Gateway that would then spit out the changes that could be monitored. And so each system would then know sort of when it was being called to do something. If you had a whole processing chain for imaging and things like that. And also, we actually just released, so we talk about the elastic scalability here a little bit. So our 1.4 release, which just went out about 2 weeks ago, I think, has added something we call SGXL, which actually enhances the ability for Sync Gateway to scale to even larger situations than it could before. So you can, we have customers out there that are already using this with large numbers of users, but this is one of the things where, if you look at other solutions, they are really easy to kind of get off the ground in some cases for simple cases where like you have just a few users, or the mistake a lot of people will often make is that you're building your app and you're testing it when it's always connected, and you don't realize the problems that show up when you're not connected. But also just the scaling that can happen when you go from developing your app and trying it out with just a few users in small scenarios to building out to something where imagine that you start scaling up to hundreds of thousands of users and things like that. And then we've already talked a bunch about Couchbase Server. One of the things I want to highlight about Couchbase Server actually is, so actually let me back up for a second. So who's familiar with NoSQL data? A few people. Okay, so you have a reasonable, it's a very brief thing for people who aren't familiar with it. NoSQL is just this very broad term that's kind of an ad hoc term that for a bunch of types of databases that don't follow the relational model. In particular, Couchbase is something we call a document database. So the idea is you're storing, if you imagine like one page here or something, I might, instead of breaking this up the way you would in a relational database, I would actually just take all of the information on this page and store it using JSON as a single entity. And so there's a bunch of reasons you do that. Some of the nicer things for developers is that JSON is much closer to the structures that you use typically in programming than relational tables are. So you don't need a system that translates from your SQL tables to your objects like you do in a relational system typically. And there's a bunch of other things about flexibility and scalability and such that come up. Sorry for the very, very short version of that. But that's what our NoSQL database, and I shouldn't say just ours, document databases, of the classes of document databases, or of NoSQL databases, document databases are really kind of the most flexible. The other types of NoSQL databases tend to have a little bit more sort of niche applications. And then, of course, another thing that's important is that we have a lot of end-to-end security. As you expect, all the data transport happens over secure connections. But then we have things like role-based access control and pluggable authentication mechanisms. We actually support OpenID Connect, which was really designed for things. So there's a lot of third-party ones. If you don't want to have your own infrastructure for accounts and stuff, you can plug into Google or Facebook or these. And also encryption and rest, so the ability to encrypt the database on the device. So, in the security world, sort of the more layers of protection you have. So even if you're doing full device encryption, it's not a bad idea to encrypt the database itself as well, if you're concerned about security issues. So that kind of gives an idea of the what I, like I said, refer to as the Couchbase Mobile stack. Does anybody have any questions right now about that? We're going to see how it plays out in the application in a minute here. But okay, cool. So let's dive into React Native a little bit here. So I'll start with the simple sort of hello world app. So this is how you get started. So I won't go through how you install React. Facebook has a very nice intro page that walks you through how to install it for the different platforms. But once you get it set up, this is how you create a new project. It's very straightforward. It's actually doing a ton of things. I truncated, so what I'm showing the output, the initialization command, and I hacked out a ton of the output from it. Because it's loading a huge number of packages and such under the hood. And then it handily ends at the end with instructions on how to run things. And so it's actually taking care, it installs the command line interface piece for you that you use to build, and your build is actually really simple. You just tell it to run the application. And so this is what you get out of that sample if you build it. So I just took screenshots of both the Android simulator and iOS, and you can see, this is all built from the same code base, and we'll take a look at the code base in just a second. But you can see that it's producing the two apps that essentially are doing the same thing. So with that, let's actually go and take a look at what that code looks like. So there are several ways you can build and run things. You can actually, once you set that up, you can open up in either Android Studio or in Xcode and start building things with those tools. For this, I thought it'd be a little nicer. I find this a little more pleasant to look at, so I'm using Visual Studio Code, which actually has a plugin for React. So let's take a look at the structure. So this is essentially, except for the addition of some stuff that Visual Studio Code cares about, this is just the resulting set of files and code base that you get out of that initialization piece. And so let's look at some of the critical pieces. So the kind of main parts to start with are, so this is essentially the top level of your application root, written in JavaScript. And this is the iOS version, if you see. So we have the Android version in the file index. So these files have special meaning to React Native. The index iOS JavaScript and the index Android JavaScript. It knows basically that that's going to be your entry, going to define your entry point. So just kind of walking through what's going on here. So we start out by importing, not surprisingly, a few things from React. So you're actually importing, interestingly enough, some pieces from React. So remember I talked about how React is a JavaScript framework. And then you separately have the React Native framework. And then, as we mentioned, I'm going to blow this up a little bit more, actually. I'll make sure people can see that. So here you have an example of where we're creating a class that's going to be a UI piece, and so you extend that from the component. So we talked about how you can build this. It's intended to make it so that you can easily build your UI out of a bunch of components. And you see how interesting this is, that you have only one method in here, and that's this render method. And you see what looks like, it sort of looks almost like HTML tags, right, mixed in here. And it's really interesting. So you have your sort of top level container, this view element. And I talked about the styling, and we'll see the styling a little bit farther down, but where you're supplying the styling. So this is almost, it looks in some ways a lot like web development. But again, these are actually being converted into they're being transpiled into JavaScript. And then we create a little text element, so you actually saw the UI straight up. A few text elements. And so this render method is really kind of at the core of how that's the method that's going to get called whenever this component is supposed to build itself. And so you're returning all of this, which then of course the back end knows how to digest and use to build that component. And then so a lot of the layout, it turns out, is actually controlled a lot like you do layout in Web 2. So looking at the style, you can see, I don't know if people are familiar with CSS, this looks a lot like, all the way down to the point where they use the Flexbox, which is a new-ish way of controlling layout in Web. Now it's not exactly like CSS, so you do have to kind of watch out for some gotchas, but it's actually not too terribly hard to sort of sit down and guess at what things should look like. And then so after you define that class, you go ahead and how you inform the system effectively that you have this component that's the top level component for it to use to build something is you register it with the app registry. And you give it this tag, and you give it the, so here we have just a lambda that's returning an instance of the class. So that's all the framework that kind of gets you kicked off. And we'll see that underneath, so I'll take a look, actually I'm going to take a look at the Android bit because that the source for this is actually what is in here is largely just boilerplate sort of bootstrap code that you don't have to look at all to get going with this. There are a couple things in here that so one of the things that since you're using JavaScript, there's actually, you can use a lot of JavaScript libraries. In fact, React for networking uses a library called Fetch, and we'll actually use instead of using the SDK that's generated by, sorry, I think I'm getting some feedback, but if you use the library that is generated by that Swagger code editor that I showed you, in some ways, it's cool that it can produce it for whatever language you want. It's not always doesn't necessarily follow the language paradigms the best. So I encourage people, if you use a Swagger spec to implement something, that you look for a native version of the client. So typically it'll be something that can consume the Swagger spec and produce your API for it from it. And so in our case, I'll show you later where we're actually using that, and so you would need to add that to the list of packages here that you're using. So there are some things where you have to go in and modify this, but for the most part, it's basically sort of boilerplate. And this is really interesting. I don't know how many people are familiar with Android development, but activity is really your main user interface piece, and typically you have all sorts of stuff happening under here. One of the core lifecycle methods that you have in here is your onCreate method. So you pretty much don't ever see an activity without an onCreate method, but interestingly enough, there's just this one component name, and you see where we've got that tag that we used when we registered the component and with the app registry as a root, we tagged it with a string, and we're just handing back the name of that component that we want to instantiate here. So that's all it's taking to create that application. Now, if I can get myself back out of here.
Sorry, are any of these files auto-generated, or? So
everything in here was auto-generated by that.
But every time, if you change now the name of the component, it gets auto-generated, the activity, or not?
So if you change the name of the component, so yeah, you would have to go and change. Like if you wanted the root to be different, you would need to go and change. Yeah, the piece here. So you probably you could handle that easily, and at least in Android, you could set it up as a resource string or something like that. And, so it effectively becomes wired together and easy to change. So there are a few neat things to show. I actually didn't want to spend the time to have the iOS simulator come up, but let's go ahead and fire off. So this is the root. I don't know if you can see it, but I'm in the root of that. This is the top level directory that was created when I initialized the project. And so just from that top level, I can tell it to run either the iOS or the Android version. I've already built this, so if you run this for the first time, it's going to invoke Xcode and compile a bunch of things, and you're going to see streams of compile results come back. But here, of course, it does it really quickly because I've already built it. And I just fired up the wrong thing. Let me get out of that. Sorry, I'm already in the to-do list instead of the other one. I actually want to get rid of this. So, I'll run the iOS version of this again. Now you notice this little window that's popping up here in the middle. That's something that they call the packager. So the packager is actually responsible for taking your JavaScript and essentially compiling it and bundling it up and making it available to for the application in this kind of build environment. And it enables some really cool things. So okay, so let's go back and see this reload in action, hopefully. So let's move this aside a bit. So here I've got my you see the text that's reflected in the application. Right now it's just saying welcome to React Native, and I'll just change it to hello world. And I save that, and bang. I get to see the update in my application right away. And I'll actually show some of the other stuff that was going on here in this, like so the debugging capability in particular is a little more interesting when we get into the other application. So yeah, that's one of the things that people really like about this. You can actually even do what they call a hot reload. So if you have something that's saving the JavaScript as you go, it'll reflect things as you type stuff. So that was the quick kind of introduction to hello world of that. So I think the key points to get across, you can see how a little bit of the app entry points, how you actually structure components, how easy it is to build stuff, that's kind of declarative aspect of the UI. It's not really showing things like I talked about how your user interface is kind of a function of the state. So we'll talk about, I'll show some of how that works later on. Does anyone have any kind of questions at this point? I think I showed everything I wanted to. Okay, great. So actually the next part, I'll just jump straight into looking at this to-do project. So let me switch over to that. Whoops. So one of the things about the packager is that it's monitoring the particular source tree that you're working on. So if you move to a different one, you want to get rid of the old, because otherwise it'll keep trying to bundle things based on that first application, even though I'm trying to work on a different one. So I kill that, and let me show you what this application looks like. So I'll drop that. And of course I already spoiled it a little bit by showing it ahead of time, but so there we go. It's loaded everything up, and now we have this. It's simple, but it's really kind of, I think, nice looking application. So we're building a really easy to-do list here. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually create a new list, which I will cleverly call, I don't know, I'll call it something else. I'll call it Fred. Because if I call it list, there's going to be just too many things named list floating around. So, so bang, I've got my list there. If I click on it, I get my detail. So here you can actually, so we want to illustrate the synchronizing across multiple users, right? So I have something now where besides setting up my to-do list of tasks, that I can also give access to that list to other users. So this, works like you'd expect. I'll remind myself to do something. There you go. And actually, I forgot to check this. I'm about to do something that I should have, and I apologize for this. I think this is already synchronizing in the background. So if I go to my database, hopefully I'm seeing this information. This could go horribly wrong. So let me refresh this. No, it looks like I do not actually set up synchronization. So, like I said, I'm going to go through the code. I really want to get across what some of the basic stuff looks like. We could go for a long time actually walking through this example because it includes things like setting up all the synchronization stuff and authentication and all of this, which we don't really have time for tonight. So I can talk a little bit more. I think maybe I'll just kind of wait till afterwards and talk people through more if you want to find out more about some of the sync capabilities and stuff. So let's go back actually and look at the code for this. Let me get this guy off. Okay, so here we have the structure, and so we have the same thing. So your entry points are still the same. We have but in this case, we've actually used this in conjunction with Flux, so it looks a little bit different. So here we actually are putting our sort of top-level version of the application is bundled up in this app directory, and then so here we're importing the class that I'll take a look at in a second there, and registering that as the top-level component. And you can see, the tagging of calling it the React Native Lite example. And let me move this further over. Actually, I don't think that's not interfering, or is it interfering? Yeah, it is interfering. I want to show debugging with this, so I'm not going to shut that down. But so it's the same form where you're getting a class and you're registering it as a top-level component for the application, and that's how it all gets wired together for React to know how to do what it's going to do. So now let's go take a look at that application code. So this is where we're going to start to get into the interesting stuff. So first of all, we saw that what were the components of this, the elements of this interface? Well, there were three different lists that we had, but they're essentially the same kind of component, right? They're just displaying different data under the hood. So actually, before I jump that, let me back up and take a look. So sorry, I should dive a little bit more into how the application is actually getting kicked off here. So you'll see these index.js. That's kind of like the default. I mean, it's just like the web where most web servers are configured to go look for. If you don't specify a particular page, they're just going to pull up an index page by default. And so you have that same paradigm here where the index.js is what React is looking for a lot of times at different levels. And so you have this interesting thing here where you start to see, so we have the same kind of bit where you're importing these elements from the library. We actually go ahead and you see where we're importing the Couchbase pieces, and we import, like I said, we're using Flux. So Flux is, among other things, has this kind of wrapper around the navigation. So there's navigation elements in React Native, but Flux is actually wrapped it in this route tag that makes it even simpler to use, and we'll see how the route tag shows up. So you see the same situation here where I've got what's going to be the top of my UI hierarchy that's extending the component class. But now here we see in the constructor is the first case where we see state involved. So this has special meaning to React. On any object, the field called state is the thing that it's going to monitor for changes to know when to re-render the UI. And so here we're just initializing the state to be empty, and we're actually waiting until another part of the component lifecycle. So there's this lifecycle called the component did mount. So that's when the component is actually essentially wired into the UI and is ready to go. Where we now start making our calls using and get wired into the client to start using Couchbase Lite. So to use Couchbase Lite, it's really straightforward. You create a manager object as a database manager object. From that, you get a database instance. And in this case, this is actually kind of preparing all of this to hook into it's kind of a wrapper around the Couchbase Mobile, the native part that exports a REST client server that you can hook into. So if you look at the native Couchbase Lite stuff, you'll see these manager and like the database calls are part of the standard setup. It's just usually a couple lines of code. But then you'll typically be seeing, the direct calls into the API. But here we'll start to see where we're getting calls in that are REST-based calls instead. It's interesting here. So our render function again showing, and the codes, if the database manager isn't there, it's not going to try and show anything because it has no way to get any data out of it. Otherwise, it's going to render its view based on this other class, this app class, and it's going to feed in a parameter to it. So we have the app class actually in the same source here, so we can take a look at that immediately. And here we actually see the props thing. So this is an interesting thing about how data is kind of handled in React. There's sort of two special forms of data that are meaningful, or fields that are meaningful to React in terms of data. One is the properties. And so the properties is considered kind of immutable data object that you pass in. Then that's got things like the style that you apply to the components will be part of that. So it's usually something where the parent is passing in this and to configure, the look and feel of the component. And it's not meant for storing or tracking changes to the UI or anything. It's expected that it's just kind of sitting there. And then the other one, like I said, is that state field, and that's the one that React knows to sort of monitor automatically. And so it's doing all of this complex, wiring of the data flow behind the scenes just based on these two properties of that you're hooking on to the component object. So in here we have the same thing. We have the constructor where we're going to set up the look and feel of the application from that with the properties. Once we actually activate this component, then if we've got a login flow enabled, it's going to kick over for authentication. It's going to kick you over to have the user authenticate a session. Otherwise, it's going to start up the data manager, and we'll take a look at that class in a second. And then we get into the rendering, and this is where you get, like I talked about, the navigation being done here with this special tag. So this router tag is actually coming from Flux, not from React. And it's encapsulating React's normal navigation system and simplifying it. And so you have this concept of scenes. And I think this is actually, one of the nice things about this is that this is really easy to read, like what's going on here, right? So you have, you can kind of guess what's happening just from looking at the structure of this. So a router, okay, so that makes sense. It's got something to do with channeling the flow of my application. And then I've got these multiple scenes that are, and I can kind of look at it, it's like, oh, the one's got a title of login. This is going to be, some kind of login UI. Down here, I've got my first list piece, the title list. So that's actually showing you the UI for that initial list. And then you have like the detail list is another scene. And so that right there, you've got essentially the top level pieces of that whole UI that I showed you all in one piece. And then actually the styling for this is really simple. It's just defining, it's using a bunch of default styling and using a Flexbox layout. Any questions on that? So let's go take a look at.
Well, actually, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So if you scroll up, no, not so much, just a little bit. I guess, yeah. So scroll back down, please. Yeah. Okay, right there. So loading flow enabled. Does that mean we're logged in right there?
No, that's actually there's a few parameters that we have that you can set to control. So since this is actually designed to be a tutorial, we don't have people do the login piece initially. So there's actually just a flag that you can set that sets it up.
Okay.
So that's kind of special purpose to this tutorial. So actually, I want to take a look at the kind of the UI pieces first, and then we'll drill down on the actual database side. Really, kind of simply that what you see underneath each of these pieces here. So you remember I had, when I went into the list detail, I had two lists, right? One was for my list of tasks, and one was for users. So again, I show up. I have my index.js. For each of those, and if we go in and take a look at one of them, you'll end up seeing, so there's a bunch of the database code in here, but when we're actually rendering the where is it? Oh, there it is. So when we're rendering the UI here, we're actually deriving this from a one component. So we create a reusable list component that we call a common list here, and then we've defined a bunch of operations on that, and you end up assigning the methods that are going to be called based on that. And then do a little bit of wrapping it up into the container for it, and you're done. So this is showing some of that modularity that we talked about that React is trying to enable. And so let's go take a look at that common list piece here. So here we see, so the index, so these guys are still extending a component, but they're really building the UI out of this other component. So we look at the common list code. Once again, it's extending a component, and here we start to see where you get the reaction of state. So you have this visibility setting that you can tweak that'll show up in the rendering later on. So you can see the connection here between setting this state piece here, the prompt visible is originally set to false, and then when we get into the rendering code, you can see in this prompt element that we take a look at the visibility state, and then it's going to generate part of the UI dependent on that visibility state. And then actually, this is the way that the set state call goes hand in hand with the state variable, where this is the call where you use to update the state, and that actually is hooked by React Native so that it knows that you just updated the state, and it knows to go see what you've done and figure out now how to go through the whole rendering piece. And so I think you get the idea that essentially, we structured this to take out the variable bits of it and expose those through methods that you can call on the component. And it turns this into a reusable piece that you can apply in several places inside of the application. So that's really cool. I mean, you can imagine how quickly you can actually start developing UI based on this. I mean, once you've got another kind of library, and there's actually a, I'm going to forget the name of the website. It's called like JS something, but if you Google for React Native components, there's a site out there that has a whole slew of libraries that people are building for UI components and stuff that you can just feed into your applications. Okay, so with all of that, let's get a little bit deeper into looking at what's actually going on with Couchbase. So here's actually in the data manager, these are the flags that I talked about. So right now we have the login flow is turned off. So actually if I have syncing turned on, I think this is all I have to do to so I don't know if you noticed the bundler blip up there, but when I saved this piece, it actually went ahead and reloaded things. So I won't do it yet, but I'll go back and see. I think that's all that I need to enable. Oh, that's part of it. I'm looking at the wrong database too. Oh, I've got my backend misconfigured. That's part of what's going on. Actually, let me cheat. I called my backend database DB instead of to do, so that's part of why it wasn't saving. So I'm going to skip over the views part and go back to it in a second because I really want to illustrate illustrate use of now of this Swagger client. So so here's actually where we see the first example of a call and what Swagger is doing. And how many people are familiar with JavaScript promises? Just a couple. Okay, so promises are a way of doing kind of asynchronous work in JavaScript. And so we're using actually kind of the promise structure here. And so it's nice. Essentially what you need to know to read this example is that these calls are setting up to happen asynchronously, but then you can chain things to have so that you can have one thing follow after another. So what I've got here now is this first example where I'm actually creating the database. So under my manager class, so the manager is actually the instance of the Swagger client that was created. And I'll go back and look at where that was set up. And under that, I don't know, if we go back and look at the Swagger spec that I had up, if you saw that there were things that were kind of grouped according to what parts of the system they were affecting. So there's all the database calls, and so here we're actually creating the database with a put call. So one thing that's a little bit of a negative with Swagger is that it doesn't actually define. There's no specification for what these names are going to come out for the end methods. So you'll see different ones. We took the naming approach of naming it after the type of REST call. So put, get, post, those things, and then the endpoint chained out, and then you have the parameters that you supply. So this is pretty straightforward, right? Creating the database is a put call to the database, and you just have the database name. And then once that's come through, assuming that it succeeded, it's going to then execute the then piece. If it fails, it's going to execute this catch piece. So then the then piece, this is essentially the first sort of starting up of the database and gets it ready to run. So once, assuming that call goes through and completes correctly, we're going to go ahead and start up some other database operations. And so if we jump down to where that's happening, we can see it's just the same sort of thing where now we're getting information about the database and then setting up for views. So views in Couchbase Lite, I said that it was a fully functional database, and what I meant in part with that is that you can actually do querying against the database using, so currently we use MapReduce queries. So, and to part of the MapReduce queries, you set up a view. So a view is kind of like an index. You can think of it as an index into the data. So you actually set up in a view, you determine which pieces of a document you want to go into that index. And then when you're doing queries with a MapReduce later on, you can base them off of the data that you've pushed out into that index. So we have to. One of the things is that views aren't persistent. You have to set up the views again each time that you create your application. And the cool thing is that you actually write the code for the MapReduce part of the view in whatever language you're developing for. So if I'm writing in JavaScript, I write the MapReduce functions in JavaScript. If I'm writing in for Android native and I'm using Java, I can write it in Java. If I'm writing for iOS for like Swift, I can write it in Swift. So that makes it just fit in nicely with the structure of the rest of the application. And so we can start looking at some other of the endpoints here. So here, this is where, like, to start and stop replications. So replication is kind of an alternative term for syncing. So we talk about syncing as kind of the meaning, synchronizing your data is sort of an overarching term for it. Replications are the actual process of two devices talking to each other to synchronize data back and forth. So the most common kind of structure you have here is where you'll have clients that start both what we call, so they're each replication is directional. So I can do something like a pull replication is only getting data from a remote database and pulling that updated information to my local database. A push replication is going the other way, where I'm pushing my information, my changes out to the remote database. So the most common kind of pattern you'll see is where you have a bunch of clients that are all talking and doing push and pull replications to a sync gateway instance. And then sync gateway takes care of then marshaling the changes to, and this is where the access control, so the access control is basically happening in sync gateway, where it takes care of marshaling it to the other database, client databases that are authorized for that data. So you can see here in the body, you can actually see that happening here so setting up this replication. My source, in this case, I'm setting up a pull replication. So my source is the sync gateway, is the remote database. And I'm just going to sit there and listen to it continuously for updates. So that's, again, another kind of typical pattern where instead of bringing up and down replications and trying to guess when there's data to update, you just set it to listen all the time. And things will get automatically synchronized. And then you'll see where I flip it around and set up another replication here where the source is my own local database, but the target now is flipped around to be the sync gateway URL. And I set that up here, so currently I'm running it on my local machine. So I think, we've been going for a long time now, so I think I'll start to kind of wrap it up here. I do want to show, actually really quickly, debugging a little bit. That gets you an idea of we don't, like I said, we don't have a JavaScript SDK, but we were able to generate it by creating this Swagger specification. And you can see that it's actually really direct and very easy to use here. And the patterns of the calls and stuff just follow pretty much the expected pattern. They follow the pattern of the calls that you would see in the native SDKs for Android and iOS. And it's very much kind of in the paradigm of JavaScript, and despite the fact that we didn't build it ourselves. Are there any questions about that? So I think I'll wrap it up. And I'll see whether synchronization is working at this point. So hopefully it reloaded that. But the other thing that I wanted to show, so you can actually bring up, we showed the bringing up the this developer panel. So this is something that's only available when you're developing the app. You would normally switch a flag that basically turns it off. So what's cool is you hit that, and if it is nice to me, it will automatically pop up. So you actually get to debug using the tools from Chrome, and I think it also supports Firefox. And so we can take a look. This is going to be maybe too small to see very well. I don't know if I can blow it up. But I can start drilling down in here. So what's happening is it's actually running the JavaScript in this tab in Chrome. So I can get in here and start doing things like setting breakpoints and such. So we could even, go in and let's see. Let me see if I can do something interesting with one of the lists or something. So if I go into common list, now if I go back to my emulator and do something, I think I've probably hit the breakpoint already. But you get, so if you can see over here, I've got my whole call stack and everything. It gives you a bunch of nice tooling for actually dealing with. So they've capitalized on a lot of the things that are already available for doing JavaScript development and such. So that's I think kind of important.